The PlayStation 1 Classic is out, and that got us thinking, remember the PS1? Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 PlayStation 1 facts you probably didn't know. Number 10, the CPU from the original PlayStation is actually, as of 2006, the same processor that runs the New Horizons space probe that, back in 2015, actually made it to Pluto. That's right, that Final Fantasy VII causing chip has guided space equipment from NASA themselves. Now you might think that's not very technologically advanced. Why'd they launch a PlayStation chip in 2006? Well, it's not so much that they need a lot of power. What they need is something that can stay on a long time. Something reliable. Something like the original PlayStation. Oh yeah, I've left that thing on for days at a time. And that's including all of the other hardware that's not the CPU. The CPU itself is a very reliable piece of engineering, and NASA chose it for good reason. Number 9, some of the original PlayStation 1 games had CD audio as their game music. I mean, it seems like a fairly obvious prospect. Suddenly, we're using CDs for our games. Why not use CD audio, the highest quality kind of audio? Now, this was obviously before audio compression that didn't totally ruin the audio, but because it was set up this way, a lot of PlayStation 1 discs you could put into a normal CD player and they'd play. Like you could play the game music in the CD player. But an interesting note on the flip side, the CD player in the PS1 is considered by some who have done in-depth analysis as a better CD player than a lot of the highest-end CD players of the era. It was a matter of getting a good connection to whatever stereo system you're planning on using, but I'm actually somewhat inclined to believe that. Number 8, there were 2 PlayStation 1 games that had, wait for it, scratch and sniff discs. Those games were Gran Turismo 2 and FIFA 2001. Now, one would think that for a scratch and sniff disc, maybe slightly different titles would be picked. Like, there was a game called My Disney Kitchen, in which you played as a bunch of Disney characters, creating a bunch of delicious food. But no, it's FIFA and Gran Turismo 2. And no joke, they were made to smell like a soccer field and like car tires, which aren't smells that I spend a lot of time pursuing, so to speak. It's still an interesting fact, but it's one of those like, why did you do this type facts. Number 7, all PlayStation 1 CDs had a wavy groove that was inscribed in a certain frequency at the start of all of the PlayStation 1 discs. Now, a lot of people thought this was an imperfection, and so did a lot of CD readers, which just basically ignored the data that would be generated by it. But the PlayStation 1 actually used that frequency to detect which region the CD was from, and that it was an original disc. You couldn't burn that frequency into a fake disc, or at least you couldn't at the time. I don't know if you still can, but an interesting bit of copy/region protection for you there. Number 6, the original PlayStation controller was 10% larger in the US because Sony did the research and decided that it would make more sense to account for larger hands in America. Now, I'm gonna just go ahead and say, that sounds a little pseudo-science-y to me. Hands have a pretty wide variance regardless of what country you're in, and I'm guessing that a research project such as that would involve a lot of volunteers, and volunteers tend to overrepresent towards what they think is societally considered better. So, whether they did it for a good reason or not, they did do it. Nowadays, the controller is the same in both places. I'm guessing probably because they realized I was dumb. Number 5, the very first PS1 game that required the DualShock controller was developed by Sony, as one would expect if they're wanting to get people to implement their new piece of hardware, but it wasn't exactly appealing to like the coolness factor. It was Ape Escape, which nothing against Ape Escape. Ape Escape's actually, if I remember right, a fun game. I remember enjoying it. Like, I haven't played it since it came out, but I fondly remember it. Also, I remember that new controller. I was like, this is weird looking, but I could get used to this. And I did. Number 4, Sony actually allowed homebrew games on both the PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2, but the tools were not cheap. Speaking of homebrew games, stuff that was, emulation adjacent, a company called Kinect made a PlayStation emulator, released it, and sold it, called Kinect Virtual Game Station. Sony obviously didn't like this, because obviously they were kind of miserly with those homebrew game tools. And if you had an emulator, you didn't need them. And you also didn't need a PlayStation to play PlayStation games. Anyway, through legal means, Sony financially exhausted Kinectix, and then when Kinectix had no other options, they made Kinectix an offer to buy the software, which Kinectix obviously took. They didn't have anything left. They needed some money, because everybody needs money to live. Number 3, another commercial PlayStation emulator, Bleem, actually developed a version of their emulator that ran on the Sega Dreamcast. So, although the emulator itself didn't actually perfectly run all games, they created certain packs that were optimized for specific games. For instance, I remember very clearly playing Metal Gear Solid, the original game, on Dreamcast with significantly better graphics thanks to Bleemcast. Bleem also had the same issue that Kinectix had, in that Sony sued the crap out of them. Although Sony didn't win. Sony actually lost their lawsuit against Bleem. It just was too much for them. Number 2, the late great Stan Lee's first video game appearance was on the PlayStation 1. It was in 2000's Spider-Man, and interestingly enough, his last cameo was also in 2018's Spider-Man. 2 games named the exact same thing, not terribly similar to one another in some key aspects, but it's cool that he ended up in both. I feel like his likeness will probably continue to appear, but we'll see. And finally, number 1, you know Kinectix, the first company I said that Sony destroyed? The reason why they got so much ire is probably very likely because Steve Jobs hyped their emulator on stage at Macworld. Now, Sony tried pretty hard to stop the whole thing from even happening, but that did not work. Sony did not win these lawsuits against these emulators. However, they had lots more money, and therefore could outlast them. You got more money, you can beat other people. Oh well, couple of bonus points for you. The Sony PlayStation was actually only created because Nintendo stabbed them in the back. Nintendo was making the Nintendo SNES CD thing that we've all seen on the internet somewhere. And for whatever reason, they decided not to do it and didn't tell Sony anything about it, so they ended up going with Philips, which that was dumb. So Sega agreed to continue the work that Sony had done with Nintendo, and like some top Sega people were very condescending about the PlayStation and called it a stupid idea, which obviously that's a hilarious criticism given what the Sega Saturn ended up being. And anyway, they ended up sending Sony out to do their own thing as well, and Sony was like, you know what, F this. We are going to do our own thing. And they've really kind of won, haven't they? Speaking of that Nintendo PlayStation, people still love the damn thing. It's so weird to look at. It says Sony PlayStation on like an SNES controller. I would highly recommend checking it out. Did you have a PlayStation 1 back in the day? Do you still play some of those games? Or did you pick up a PS1 Classic and are disappointed like the rest of us? Leave us a comment. Let us know what you think. And if you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. So click that subscribe button and the notification bell so you get notifications when we upload new videos every single day. As always, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at FalconHero. We'll see you next time right here on gameranx.